My name is David Woodsman. I am 39 years old, and I work as a park ranger for Baxter State Park in northern Maine, responsible for wilderness patrol, visitor safety, and search and rescue operations across the park's 209,644 acres of pristine wilderness. Before we begin, let us know in the comments where you are watching from, please. I've been working as a park ranger for 12 years, spending the last 8 at Baxter State Park, which is home to Mount Katahdin, the northern terminus of the Appalachian Trail, and some of the most remote wilderness in the northeastern United States. The park sees about 60,000 visitors annually, but vast sections receive minimal human traffic. This happened last September during the fall hiking season, when I was investigating the disappearance of Jennifer Walsh, a 25-year-old from Boston who had been day hiking the Chimney Pond Trail, one of the park's most popular routes, leading to views of Mount Katahdin's knife edge. Walsh had registered at the park entrance gate around 7 a.m., with plans for a solo day hike to Chimney Pond and back, approximately 6 miles round trip. She was properly equipped with day hiking gear and had indicated she planned to return to her campsite at A-Ball Campground by late afternoon. When she failed to return by evening, fellow campers reported her missing to park headquarters. I began search operations immediately, following standard protocols for overdue hikers in the Baxter State Park wilderness, where weather conditions can change rapidly and terrain poses serious challenges, even for experienced hikers. The Chimney Pond Trail is well-marked and heavily traveled, making it unlikely for hikers to become lost under normal circumstances. The trail gains about 1,400 feet of elevation over 3 miles and passes through mixed forest before reaching the pond, which sits in a dramatic glacial cirque below Mount Katahdin's towering granite faces. I started my search at first light, following the trail from the trailhead and checking for any signs of Walsh's passage. About 2 miles in, at a trail junction where the Chimney Pond Trail intersects with the North Basin Trail, I found her day pack sitting beside the trail marker, positioned as if she'd set it down deliberately. The pack contained all her essential hiking gear: water, food, first aid kit, rain jacket, and personal items, including her car keys and identification. Most concerning was that her hiking boots were also in the pack, despite the fact that she would have needed them to continue hiking on the rocky trail. I found no tracks or signs of struggle around the pack location. The trail showed normal foot traffic from other hikers, but nothing that indicated Walsh had left the trail voluntarily or encountered any problems that would cause her to abandon her gear. Expanding my search area, I followed both the Chimney Pond Trail and the North Basin Trail, checking side trails and potential routes where a disoriented hiker might have wandered. The North Basin Trail leads into more remote wilderness areas that receive very little visitor traffic. About a mile up the North Basin Trail, I discovered Walsh's hiking clothes folded neatly on a large boulder beside the trail. The clothing was arranged in an orderly stack: shirt, pants, socks, underwear, as if she'd carefully undressed and arranged her items before continuing into the wilderness. The clothing showed no signs of damage, tearing, or weather exposure. Everything appeared to have been recently placed, despite the fact that Walsh had been missing for over 18 hours. Most disturbing was that the clothing arrangement suggested deliberate action rather than emergency or accident. I immediately radioed for additional search personnel and established a search command post near the location where Walsh's clothing had been discovered. Over the next 3 days, we conducted intensive searches using ground teams, search dogs, and helicopter reconnaissance, covering the entire North Basin area and surrounding wilderness. The search operation included volunteers from local mountain rescue teams, Maine Warden Service personnel, and experienced hikers who knew the Baxter State Park backcountry intimately. Despite covering every accessible area within a reasonable distance of Walsh's last known location, we found no additional trace of her. On the 4th day of searching, one of our search dogs indicated interest in an area about 2 miles further into the North Basin wilderness, in terrain that would be extremely difficult for someone to navigate without proper footwear. The area included steep rocky slopes and dense forest that would challenge even experienced wilderness travelers. We found no physical evidence of Walsh in that area, but several search team members reported unusual phenomena that made them uncomfortable continuing the search in that location. Sounds of voices calling from areas where no searchers were present, and feelings of being watched by unseen presences from the dense forest. The official search was suspended after 6 days when we'd exhausted all reasonable possibilities for Walsh's location. She was listed as a missing person, and her case was turned over to Maine State Police for continued investigation. But no additional evidence was ever discovered. Walsh's disappearance followed a pattern I'd encountered twice before, during my time at Baxter State Park. Hikers who vanished completely after abandoning their gear and clothing in ways that suggested deliberate rather than accidental actions. In each case, extensive searches had failed to locate any trace of the missing persons. I spoke with veteran park rangers who had worked at Baxter for decades about similar disappearances. They described a pattern of vanishings that occurred primarily in the North Basin and other remote areas of the park, always involving solo hikers, and always resulting in discoveries of abandoned gear arranged in ways that seemed purposeful. One retired ranger told me about traditional knowledge from the Penobscot Nation, whose ancestors had lived in this region for thousands of years before the park was established. According to tribal teachings, certain areas of the Maine wilderness were considered dangerous for solitary travelers, particularly those who weren't properly prepared spiritually for wilderness travel. The traditional knowledge described entities or forces that could influence human behavior in ways that cause people to abandon safety measures and venture into areas where they couldn't survive or be found. These influences were strongest during certain seasons and in areas that held particular spiritual significance. I continue working at Baxter State Park because it is important conservation work, protecting one of Maine's most significant wilderness areas. But I am much more cautious now about solo hiker safety recommendations, particularly for trails that access remote areas of the park. When hikers go missing, I begin search operations immediately rather than waiting for standard reporting periods. My name is James Morrison. I am 46 years old, and I work as a trail maintainer for the Maine Appalachian Trail Club, responsible for maintaining the 281-mile Maine section of the Appalachian Trail from the New Hampshire border to Mount Katahdin in Baxter State Park. I've been working trail maintenance for 19 years, spending countless hours in some of the most remote sections of the Maine wilderness, including the famous 100-mile wilderness, the longest stretch of the Appalachian Trail without a road crossing, which challenges even experienced through hikers. This happened last June while I was conducting routine maintenance on a section of trail about 40 miles south of Monson, in an area that passes through dense forest managed by timber companies, but open to public recreation under conservation easements. I was working alone, following standard procedures for trail maintenance in remote areas, carrying tools for clearing blowdowns, repairing bog bridges, and marking trail routes through areas where the path might be difficult for hikers to follow during poor weather conditions. The work requires hiking several miles to reach maintenance locations, then spending full days working on trail improvements in areas where the nearest road access can be 20 or 30 miles away. It is demanding physical work in country where a serious injury could result in multi-day rescue operations. Around noon, while clearing a large fallen tree that had blocked the trail about 15 miles north of Chairback Gap Lean, I encountered evidence of a hiker in distress that immediately triggered my concern for visitor safety in the Maine wilderness. Scattered around the fallen tree were personal items that belonged to a backpacker, water bottles, energy bars, clothing items, and parts of camping gear. The items appeared to have been abandoned hastily, possibly during an emergency situation that required immediate attention. I examined the scattered gear and found a hiking permit and trail registration that identified the owner as Mark Sullivan, a 32-year-old from Connecticut, who was attempting a northbound through hike of the Appalachian Trail. His permit indicated he'd been hiking for about 4 months and was nearing completion of his 2,190-mile journey. Most concerning was that Sullivan's backpack was hanging from a tree branch about 12 feet above the trail, positioned in a way that would have been impossible for him to place there himself. The pack appeared to have been deliberately hung at that height, but the location and method defied logical explanation. I attempted to retrieve the backpack using my trail maintenance tools and found that it contained all of Sullivan's essential hiking gear: sleeping bag, shelter, stove, and food supplies. Most disturbing was that his hiking boots were in the pack, despite the fact that he would have needed them to continue hiking on the rocky Maine Trail terrain. I found no footprints or other signs that would indicate Sullivan's direction of travel after abandoning his gear. The trail surface showed normal traffic from other hikers, but nothing that suggested where Sullivan might have gone or what circumstances had led to the abandonment of his equipment. Following trail maintainer protocols for missing hiker situations, I hiked to the nearest location with cell phone service and contacted Maine Warden Service to report finding abandoned gear that might indicate a hiker in distress. I provided GPS coordinates and detailed descriptions of what I discovered. Maine Warden Service initiated a search operation within 6 hours, sending search teams to the area where I'd found Sullivan's gear. I assisted with the search effort, using my knowledge of local trail conditions and alternate routes that disoriented hikers might follow. Over the next 4 days, search teams covered extensive areas both north and south of the gear discovery location, checking lean-tos, water sources, and side trails, where a lost or injured hiker might seek shelter. Despite intensive efforts involving ground teams and aircraft reconnaissance, no trace of Sullivan was found. The search was complicated by the remote location and challenging terrain typical of the Maine section of the Appalachian Trail. The 100-mile wilderness includes areas where helicopter access is limited and where ground searches must cover vast expanses of dense forest with minimal visibility. On the 5th day of searching, one of the search teams reported discovering additional abandoned gear about 8 miles north of the original location, near the Hermitage, a grove of old-growth pine trees that serves as a landmark for northbound hikers approaching the end of their Appalachian Trail journeys. The newly discovered items included more of Sullivan's clothing and camping equipment, again positioned in ways that suggested deliberate placement rather than accidental abandonment. Some items were found hanging from trees at heights that would require climbing skills to access. Most puzzling was that the gear was distributed along the trail in a pattern that suggested Sullivan had been systematically abandoning his equipment while continuing to hike north toward Mount Katahdin. But there were no footprints or other signs of his actual passage along the trail. The official search was suspended after 8 days when all reasonable areas had been covered, and no additional evidence could be located. Sullivan was listed as missing, and his case was turned over to Maine State Police, but no further trace of him has ever been found. Sullivan's disappearance was the third similar case I'd encountered during my years of trail maintenance work in the Maine wilderness. In each case, experienced hikers had vanished after abandoning their gear in patterns that suggested systematic rather than emergency abandonment. I spoke with other trail maintainers and Appalachian Trail volunteers who had worked the Maine section for decades. Several described similar discoveries of abandoned gear from missing hikers, always arranged in ways that seemed purposeful. But that didn't provide useful clues about what had happened to the hikers themselves. One longtime volunteer told me about traditional Penobscot knowledge regarding certain areas of the Maine woods that were considered dangerous for solitary travelers. According to tribal teachings, some areas could influence human behavior in ways that caused people to make decisions that separated them from safety and survival resources. The volunteer explained that the 100-mile wilderness passed through several areas that traditional knowledge identified as places where spirits or forces could cause confusion and disorientation that led travelers away from established paths and into areas where they couldn't be found or helped. I continue maintaining trails throughout the Maine section of the Appalachian Trail because it is important work that helps thousands of hikers safely complete their journeys through some of the most challenging terrain on the entire trail. But I am much more alert now to signs of missing or distressed hikers, and I document any unusual discoveries thoroughly, while understanding that some disappearances in the Maine wilderness might involve factors beyond conventional search and rescue capabilities. My name is Robert Highland. I am 52 years old, and I work as a mountain rescue coordinator for the Maine Warden Service, specializing in high-angle rescue operations on Mount Katahdin and emergency response throughout the Katahdin region of central Maine. I've been working mountain rescue for 24 years, responding to emergencies on Mount Katahdin, which at 5,267 feet is Maine's highest peak and one of the most challenging mountains in the northeastern United States. The mountain sees approximately 50,000 climbers annually, but conditions can be extremely dangerous, even for experienced hikers. This happened last October during late fall hiking season when I was coordinating search operations for 2 missing hikers who had attempted to climb Mount Katahdin via the Knife Edge Trail, one of the most technical and exposed routes on the mountain. The missing hikers were Sarah Chen and Mike Rodriguez, both experienced mountaineers from New Hampshire who had climbed extensively throughout New England. They'd registered for a day hike with plans to ascend via the Helen Taylor Trail to Pamela Peak, traverse the Knife Edge to Baxter Peak, then descend via the Chimney Pond Trail. The Knife Edge is a narrow granite ridge that connects Pamela Peak and Baxter Peak, requiring scrambling skills and good weather conditions for safe passage. The route is extremely exposed, with 1,000-foot drops on both sides, and is considered one of the most dangerous hiking trails in New England. Chen and Rodriguez had started their hike early morning under clear weather conditions, with proper mountaineering equipment and extensive experience on technical terrain. They'd indicated plans to complete the full traverse and return to their vehicle by late afternoon. When they failed to return by evening, park rangers initiated search protocols. I was called in to coordinate high-angle rescue operations. Given the technical nature of the terrain they'd been climbing, and the potential for serious accidents on the Knife Edge Traverse, we began search operations at first light, using teams positioned at multiple points around Mount Katahdin to cover the most likely routes and emergency descent options. The Knife Edge requires careful navigation, and there are several points where disoriented hikers might attempt dangerous shortcuts or become stranded on technical terrain. Around 10 a.m., one of our search teams found Chen and Rodriguez's backpacks at the base of Pamela Peak, positioned near the start of the Knife Edge Traverse. Both packs contained full mountaineering gear, including ropes, helmets, and emergency equipment that would be essential for safely navigating the technical ridge route. Most concerning was that both hikers' mountaineering boots were in their respective packs, along with their climbing harnesses and technical gear. This equipment would be absolutely necessary for safe passage along the Knife Edge, making it impossible to understand why they would have abandoned it. We found no signs of struggle or accident around the pack location. The weather had remained clear and calm throughout the previous day, with conditions that should have been ideal for the Knife Edge Traverse. There were no obvious reasons why experienced mountaineers would abandon essential safety equipment. I led a technical rescue team onto the Knife Edge itself, following the route that Chen and Rodriguez should have taken toward Baxter Peak. The traverse requires careful route, finding along the narrow granite ridge, with exposure that demands constant attention to foot placement and weather conditions. About halfway along the Knife Edge, we discovered more of their gear, water bottles, food supplies, and clothing items, scattered along the ridge in a pattern that suggested they'd been systematically abandoning equipment while continuing their traverse. But we found no footprints or other signs of their actual passage. Most puzzling was that some of the abandoned gear was positioned in locations that would be extremely dangerous to access without proper mountaineering equipment. The same equipment they'd already abandoned at Pamela Peak. The placement suggested technical climbing skills, but without safety gear. We completed the full Knife Edge Traverse and searched all potential descent routes from Baxter Peak, including the Cathedral Trail, Saddle Trail, and Chimney Pond Trail. Despite covering every reasonable route that experienced hikers might use to descend Mount Katahdin, we found no additional trace of Chen or Rodriguez. The search operation expanded to include helicopter reconnaissance and ground teams covering areas around the entire Katahdin Massif. We searched potential fall zones, emergency shelter locations, and alternate descent routes that confused or injured hikers might attempt. After 5 days of intensive searching involving over 30 rescue personnel and extensive helicopter support, we had covered every accessible area of Mount Katahdin where the missing hikers might have traveled. Despite exhaustive efforts, No trace of Chen or Rodriguez was found beyond their abandoned equipment. The case was particularly challenging because both hikers were highly experienced mountaineers with extensive technical climbing backgrounds. They were familiar with Mount Katahdin and had the skills and equipment necessary to safely complete the knife-edge traverse under the weather conditions that had prevailed. Chen and Rodriguez were officially listed as missing persons, with their case remaining open but inactive. Their disappearance followed a pattern I'd encountered several times during my rescue career. Experienced hikers vanishing on Mount Katahdin after abandoning technical gear in ways that defied logical explanation. I reviewed files from similar cases over the past 2 decades and found a consistent pattern of disappearances involving experienced hikers who abandoned essential equipment in systematic patterns while climbing technical routes on Mount Katahdin. In each case, extensive searches had failed to locate the missing persons. I spoke with Penobscot tribal elders about traditional knowledge regarding Mount Katahdin, which is considered sacred in their cultural traditions. They explained that the mountain was traditionally approached with specific spiritual preparations, and that certain areas were considered dangerous for those who weren't properly prepared. According to Penobscot teachings, Mount Katahdin is home to powerful spirits that can influence human behavior and judgment. The mountain demands respect and proper spiritual approach, and those who climb without understanding this relationship might find themselves drawn into situations beyond their control. The elders described traditional protocols for safely traveling on the mountain that included spiritual preparations and awareness of signs that indicated when conditions weren't appropriate for human presence. They emphasized that the mountain itself was alive and conscious, and that it could protect itself from inappropriate human activities. I continue working mountain rescue on Mount Katahdin because it is essential work that saves lives and helps maintain access to one of Maine's most important natural landmarks. But I am much more respectful now of traditional knowledge about the mountain and more aware that some disappearances might involve factors that conventional rescue techniques aren't designed to address.